This is the introduction to Langstroth equipment. Thank you for watching. I am Kevin England. Welcome to the lesson on parts of the Langstroth hive. In this video, we'll step through the hive stack piece by piece, providing some background as to marketplace offerings and with a handful of recommendations. Let's go ahead and get started. First thing we'll talk about is the inventory of common parts in a hive kit. Working from the bottom up, number one is the hive's bottom board. This is the base of the hive, and when it has a hive box or body on it, it serves as the main entrance to the hive for the bees. The second piece of equipment in a conventional setup, this is a 10 frame over 10 frame with mediums, is a deep box holding 10 frames with foundation. Now you can go with other configurations like 3 mediums, but in this case we'll stay with the 2 deeps. When you start a hive, you start out with only one box. As the colony grows, additional pieces of equipment are placed over top. When the bees need more space, a second deep with frames and foundation is added. These 2 boxes are typically large enough in dimension to hold the nest of bees. Going up the stack to number 4, the next piece of equipment is a medium box. It has, of course, an additional 10 frames and foundation, and as shared in Lesson 1, the brood nest typically does not grow beyond the bottom 2 boxes, so the purpose of this box over the bottom 2 deeps is for excess honey storage. As number 5, when the bees fill the first honey super, a second, and actually even more, can be added. Equipment piece number 5 is another medium super with, of course, frames and foundation. Sitting over top of that is an inner cover, that's number 6. It's placed over the hive boxes and underneath the outer cover. The inner cover serves as the cap over the bees and functions to seal off the top of the hive. And then finally we have number 7, which is the top outer cover. Now number 8 in this image is a depiction of a honeybee frame, and 9 represents a sheet of wax foundation inside that frame. This is a summary of the full hive stack, and now what we're going to do is examine each piece with a little more detail. In the next run of slides, we'll talk about each one individually, but now you know the basic stack. We said number 1 in the previous diagram was a bottom board. Actually, before we get to the bottom board, there's a piece of equipment that is shown in many beekeeping catalogs, and this is referred to as a hive stand base. This piece of equipment is not commonly used and can be considered optional in your purchase. Originally, the purpose of this device was to raise the bottom board off of the flat ground while preventing moisture from getting to the hive because it was sitting on that ground. It also has that little ramp on the front where the bees can land and return to walk into the hive. Now, as we said, this piece of equipment is obsolete. Nowadays, beekeepers, they don't put their hives on the ground. They typically place them on cement blocks, or better yet, a hive stand. In fact, like the one shown in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. We are recommending that you use a hive stand like the one depicted, and we'll talk more about that in the apiary setup lesson that follows. Now, we covered this hive stand base for the sake of being thorough. It can be reiterated that this is optional. If you do use one, however, we recommend that you do not put it on the ground. Instead, you're going to have to put it on a hive stand with the full stack over it. Now, it's personal preference as to whether you use one or not. But do consider that most people don't use them because it adds extra space to the hive stack. With the hive sitting over top of it, it means the boxes are higher up in the air. If you're going to pull a box off of the ground and put it back up on top of the stack, you have to lift it that many inches more when you have taken boxes off for inspections. And of course, they cost money, so there's a little more expense to it if you're going to buy one for each one of your hives. Now let's turn to the bottom boards. The bottom board is at the base of every hive, and there are two common offerings in the marketplace. The first one is a more traditional solid wooden bottom board, but equally as popular, and in these days, more so, the screened bottom board might be a choice that you're going to consider. Screen bottom board is a more modern era take on the customary solid bottom board, which is fairly traditional. It was developed to provide options for high ventilation and, more specifically these days, pest management purposes. In talking about that, the belief is that varroa mite, dislodged by the bees through grooming, will fall down through between the frames, and it's small enough to fall through the screen and out of the bottom of the hive. And dead varroa mite's a good varroa mite. Screen bottom boards come with a sheet of plastic, as you see in the picture. Those inserts often have a grid pattern on them. I could talk about that for just a moment. The intended design for that grid was for counting mites. When you were not letting the mites fall through the bottom board, what they did was imprinted a grid on there so that you could cover the plastic with some sort of substrate that the mites would stick to if they fell through the screen. Then you extract the plastic out and count the number of mites that have collected in between the squares, and there was some sort of formula you could use to determine what your mite load was. Usually the product that a lot of beekeepers used was petroleum jelly for this purpose. The fact is, we don't cover this as a recommended monitoring process. It's really fallen out of favor because it's woefully inadequate for being a good judge of how many mites you have in your colony. Now, we will share that it's not a terrible idea to put a sticky board in and every once in a while get a sample of how many mites fall through. You could gauge at one point there's not a lot, and then gauge later that there's quite a few, and that right there tells you that you should be looking into monitoring your mites with the more recommended methods. Again, your mileage may vary with these, but they are in practice still in these days. Now, today, many beekeepers believe in and practice integrated pest management. As you see by the description, this is a form of trying every single approach you can employ to combat against the mites. The notion is every advantage is a good advantage, and if you could find one way to help the colony out by letting mites fall through the ground, then you're better off. Actually, the truth is the jury is out as to the benefit of this. Research has suggested that screen bottom boards alone are not, by themselves, a good way to go. Just not enough mites fall through for it to be impactful. The actual report is, if you look at it, they're not effective at all. Still, beekeepers use them in hope that they're providing some benefit. Now, this comes with a smidge of a trade-off that has to be recognized. It has to do with the management consideration. When you run a bottom board screened through the summertime, you typically pull the insert out so that the mites could fall through. When colder winter sets in, every beekeeper has to go out and slide the inserts back in order to prevent the cold air from blowing up into the hive. Now, some beekeepers look at this and say that plastic insert, the sheet, which is similar to a real estate sign, just doesn't provide very good protection. When we talk about thermodynamics, somewhere in the lessons you'll learn about it, but so many beekeepers employ this that it's probably not that much of a concern. And if you want to use a screen bottom board for the advantages of mite management, then that is your personal preference. If you look at a traditional bottom board design, you'll note that they have a deep and a shallow side. Most of them, if they follow the conventional design standards, they were originally designed to be reversible. One side is supposed to be 3/4 of an inch, and the other one is supposed to be 3/8 of an inch. The premise of that design as originally intended, was that you were going to reverse the bottom board as the season goes. When the bees are fully operational, you put the deep side up, and in the wintertime, you put the shallow side up. The premise of this is the box that sits over top of the bottom board, the front edge, is the opening for the hive, and when it's set to 3/8 of an inch, a bee could pass through, but other pests could not. Now, if you look at the bottom of this frame, you'll see that there is a device that most beekeepers use, an entrance reducer. The downside of having to flip the board, if you think about it, is you have to take the entire hive stack off to the bottom board and then flip it over and then put the hive stack back. Most people do not want to deal with this at the end of the season. They'd rather just leave the deep side up all the time and put the entrance reducer in to close the entrance. Interesting principle to know about, but actually it's just not commonly practiced anymore. A final word on bottom boards, especially if you're choosing the solid version. You want to go with a manufacturer that use solid boards like the one depicted here in the base of the bottom board. To say that differently, you do not want to use a manufacturer that goes the cheap route, which employs plywood or manufactured boards in the base. One of the things about a bottom board is it's at the bottom of the hive. As the bees work through comb and foundation and other practices inside, they tend to drop crumbs. Now, a lot of times bees will clean up whatever it is that falls through, but especially in the winter months, a lot of that collects on the bottom board. When it collects, it draws moisture. And if moisture sits on the bottom board of a manufactured wood product like plywood, the wet tends to delaminate the glues, and with all the weight of the colony sitting on top, sometimes it could be a couple 100 pounds, the boxes tend to misshape the bottom board and cause you problems. So net, if you're going to buy solid wood bottom boards, make sure that they are quality bottom boards made from true lumber. Moving on to hive bodies. Let's just start with the deep hive body. You're going to need 2 of these. They're conventionally sold as unassembled pieces, and it's expected that you're going to nail and glue them together. By the photos, you can see that they use finger joint technique for joinery, and their tolerances are extremely tight. When you purchase hive bodies, we recommend that you spend a little bit more if they're offering a select offering. What we mean by that is select lumber. Some manufacturers do differentiate in the grades that they offer. We see this as a better investment. It is not uncommon for a hive box to spend a decade or more in service. In a hobbyist operation, when you buy these boxes, the better the box is, the longer it lasts. When you buy better quality, you have less knots for wood failure, straighter sides, and there's just other benefits. Now, if you don't want to spend the money, that's okay too. You can get by with a lower offering. And actually, some vendors just don't skip on quality. They offer only good boxes, and when you buy them, you're good to go. We'll talk more about buying equipment and quality when we get into the buying guides, but really, if you have the choice, buy the best quality that you can afford. One last thing about hive bodies, they're sold simply as wood pieces. We'll say this upcoming again, but it's worth reiterating. The nails, the glue, the frame rest protectors, they're all sold separately, so make sure that when you're looking in your catalog, you account when placing your order to get that stuff. Medium hive boxes, same rules as the deeps. If you go the conventional route, you're going to buy 2 boxes. In time, you're probably going to buy more of these if you're going to have some spares for honey production. A quick comment to point out is we did not recommend to buy shallow boxes. If you remember with our introduction to Hive equipment, shallow boxes are an option, but they're not really commonplace and they cause a headache. You're going to result in a third type of box and frame dimensions, which over time just complicates your storage. The limited benefit from weight, buying a smaller box, is usually not worth it, and we don't recommend it. Now, look, again, personal preference. If you decide you want to go the shallow route, go ahead, but we don't generally tell you to do that. On a conventional hive, you will have the inner cover. This is not an optional piece of equipment, and we would assume that you're going to use one in this program. That bears the point of saying that in some beekeeping literature, they tell you that you don't need one of these, that you can use a cloth or some other substrate at the top of the hive, but we want you to use a true inner cover. It's the most common way to go, and there's really no other way. 99% of beekeepers use these. Now, the inner cover is typically sealed by the bees to the edges of the top box, and without one, they would seal the outer cover to the top of the hive, and you would not be able to get your hive tool up underneath the lip of the outer cover. So again, not an optional piece of equipment. Let's talk about some of the design for these inner covers. We recommend that you, again, purchase a good quality inner cover. Some inner covers are just poorly constructed. They don't hold up to prying against them with your hive tool, which is what you're going to do every single time you go in the colony. Some of the better design elements of an inner cover include a single sheet of the thinner material, like what is shown here. To point out the opposite, sometimes manufacturers use slats of less expensive wood, and we find that the slats tend to break apart. In the wood joinery for the frame at the corners, it has sufficient staples and nails, and it has an overlap joint at the corners. A design that features a recess on both sides is what we like, and we do prefer that you buy one with the notch on the front, like shown in the picture. Now, as to the recess, it needs to be said that some manufacturers put a recess on one side while the other side is flat. We don't typically like the flat designs. The bees tend to glue them down so much, and they bridge wax from the top of the frames underneath them to the bottom of the flat side because there's just not enough bee space. This causes a lot of problems when you try to lift the inner cover off because the frames tend to come up with it, and it aggravates the bees and you end up getting stung. You want to buy one that employs a recess on both sides and provides bee space so you don't have to have that problem of bees building bridge comb. Now, one of the features of the dish design is it's meant for feeding. Some manufacturers make these really shallow and others make them a little bit deeper. The deeper side is meant to go up in the winter, so you can pour sugar on that and set the inner cover over and it'll set flat. The bees come up through the hole to the dished side and are able to get to the sugar and get some food in the wintertime if that's what's needed. A lot of times when you look at these, they're printed with this side up. That's one of the main reasons why. The roof of the hive, or sometimes called telescoping cover, is designed to sit obviously over that inner cover that we just talked about. It provides the purpose of extending the covering down over the hive, so when it rains, it doesn't get wet. Water doesn't get in when the rain blows sideways. It provides some insulative quality over top, and obviously the metal part is put there for longevity and durability. For this device, like other hive equipment, pay attention to the fit finish of the metalwork. Ideally, the corners are well designed, and the lid cover employs enough staples that it holds the tin flat and taut to the top of the roof. like the inner cover, buy one that employs real wood joinery, and these will often stand up to long-term usage and abuse, like the bottom board that we talked about earlier. A better quality roof is designed with heavier materials. Sometimes they cheap up and use 1/2 inch. You want to use 3/4 inch for this. Yes, they're a little bit heavier, but one of the things we want you to consider is it's very common practice to take the roof off, set it with the metal side down, take your boxes off when you're doing inspections, and instead of setting them down into the grass or the dirt, you set them on the inner cover or the outer cover. That's why you want one that is substantial that can hold the weight. Do your homework, buy a good quality outer cover. It will serve you well. There's another alternative to the conventional outer cover that we just talked about. It's this garden-style telescoping cover. Most of these are topped with a copper sheathing, and yeah, they cost quite a bit more than the basic, typical outer cover. There is one consideration thinking about what we just talked about. When you flip one of these over and put it on the ground, you cannot stack hive boxes on them. If you have one of these, likely you have to have some other means, like a hive bench or something like that, to put your boxes down on. It would not be our first choice, but aesthetically, a lot of people really like the look of this, and it's personal preference. They cost more, they usually serve the same purpose, and if you want one of these, then go ahead. No problem there. Just keep in mind the management practice changes you have to take into consideration. Now it's time to move to frames, and there's quite a bit to know about this. The marketplace provides a large assortment of options when it comes to beehive frame designs. Nowadays, the most common frame sold in beekeeping catalog is a wooden frame with plastic wax-coated foundation. The plastic is food grade, and the wax is beeswax. Put it on it so that it encourages the bees to build out the foundation, because typically they don't like to build stuff on plastic. Secondly, and the more traditional choice, is a wooden frame with a wax foundation sheet that you affix to the frame at the time you're building the frame and putting them into service. Now, as noted by the slide, there is another option that's pretty common out there. It's an all-plastic frame. The frame and the foundation are made from food-grade plastic. I think you could tell by the picture, we don't want you to use these. For brevity's sake, they're really troublesome. In use, we find that, unlike the other plastic frames, which are problematic, if you've watched the intro, they really don't like these. And sometimes they warp. The manufacturing process generally doesn't build them very well. They're not adherents to bee space. They're usually sold as cheap alternatives, and they're just rife with problems. Please do not buy these. Now, if you bought these already, we're going to ask you to set them aside. Don't throw them out. Just put them away somewhere. Go buy yourself a new set of frames for all your boxes. In time, when you become a competent beekeeper, and in those seasons where the bees will build wax for you, you'll learn what that means as we go through the program, then you can put these in rotation and see if you can get the bees built out. But when you're trying to get a colony from nothing to full size, don't put yourself in a compromised position by buying these. In time, if you want to use them, you could put them into rotation, but follow our guidance and replace and use the other type of frames for now. There are 10 frames to a hive body, and of course you'll need to have foundation sheets for each one of them. Wooden frames that hold wax are typically purchased unassembled, but many vendors now offer the pre-built frames for a nominal upcharge, meaning the exterior part, top bar, side bars, bottom bar. Vendor assembled frames are usually a good bargain, considering the amount of labor it takes to build a frame, and most of the time they're well built. Now, some of them cheap out, use terrible staples, and when you pry against the frame, it breaks right in the middle of the hive, and that really makes a mess for you. Strictly as a matter of convenience, though, you can consider this as an option. However, let us ply on your beekeeping heartstring. There's a certain rite of passage with the experience gained when you build your own frames. We'll provide you the instructions on the process of building the frames in an upcoming lesson. We really would love if you would go that route. Now, again, coming back, frame construction differs from vendor to vendor, and here we'll offer some buying guidance. And we'll talk more about this again when it comes to buying. Make sure that you're buying frames with substantial wood throughout. These take a lot of abuse, and you pry on them every single time with your hive tool. What we mean by that is it has heavy top bars, substantial end bars, and the bottom bars will stand up to the rigor of hive, interior, and extracting. You will, at some point during your career, drop frames, and you don't want them to break on the ground. That is really not a place you want to go. We recommend, and we'll show you pictures of this when we get to frame buying, a wedge top and a groove bottom style frame. We'll talk more about that in full detail in an upcoming lesson. The conventional setup for frames is wax foundation sheets that come with wires embedded in the wax nowadays from the factory. When you buy your foundation, make sure you use the same vendor that you use to buy your frames. Some people buy their frames cheaply from someplace and buy their wax foundation from another. Don't do this. You want to make sure that the frames and the wax are cut to fit each other flawlessly. You have to pay special attention in the beekeeping catalogs because it can be confusing sometimes to ensure the wax that you buy goes with the frame style that you purchase. So if you buy a wedge top, groove bottom frame, like we said, make sure you buy the wax that comes with that. We're killing this topic, but it's really important because if it doesn't fit, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. The wax with the wires is referred to as crimped wire foundation. This is what we expect you to use. As noted in the previous slide, wax comes with wires now, but look, this one has wires running horizontally. In the old days, beekeepers used to wire their frames and use wax without wires. This is why there's holes in the end bars. We don't recommend you do this. It's fussy, it takes skills and special tools, and it's not something you need to get involved in as a new beekeeper. As a rite of passage somewhere down the road, if you want to try this, you can look it up, or you can ask us, we'll tell you, but for now, we're not advocating that you do this. Beekeeping catalogs and internet sites offer foundation that utilize plastic sheets in lieu of the more traditional wax sheets. Frames that use wooden outer exterior just like wax, but they come with a plastic sheet that pops in like the one shown on the slide. Admittedly, this frame design has several advantages in the time for assembly, super simple, shipping, doesn't break in shipping or have problems, and for those reasons, they're extremely common. We don't advocate the use for plastic foundation if you've listened to the outro, but our contention is it's okay. If you want to go this route, go ahead. What we find is colonies starting out, more often or not, do not build well on these frames, especially in the periphery of the hive. This was mentioned briefly in the introduction presentation, and we're just going to repeat it here so you know that. We told you so. We promise that we'll be rather disappointed if we come to see your hives and they're doing terribly in plastic. We'll just leave that at there. As noted in the previous photo, a crimp wire foundation comes with embedded wires to support it from the top of the frame to the bottom of the frame. But they do require support from the sides. Frames are constructed, like we said, with the holes, and this is where the pins go in. You buy a pack of pins and you slide them in and they hold the frames. We recommend 4 per frame, and again, when we get to frame building, we'll talk more about this. Just make sure you don't forget to buy the pins. Now, there's different kind of pins out in the marketplace. In fact, you can use bobby pins. Don't buy the plastic ones of these. We find that if you knock the frame around, they pop out. The metal ones do the job, and they're not very expensive. We really prefer that you use them. They're a superior design. Frame rests. We want you to have these on all of your boxes. They protect your woodenware from hive tools when you have to go in and pry frames out. And if you want your boxes to last for over a decade or more, like we talked about earlier, this is really an important part of that equation. Don't forget when you're buying your extra hardware to ask for frame rests. They're in the catalog and they're very inexpensive. And we'll talk about how to install these when you get to the fabrication lessons. At this point, going from roof to bottom board in this lesson. Before we close, you have to acknowledge, of course, that there's so many more pieces of equipment out there for sale. But for now, what we've focused on is the basic hive pieces. Now, fear not, we will get to some more in later lessons. But for now, to keep this as compact as possible, we'll shut this lesson down. One thing to say to you is these equipment lessons, unfortunately, are a little long. It's just the nature of the beast by covering all the material. After that sidebar, we'll come back to some of the equipment that you will need, like what's shown on the slide. Feeders, hangers, queen excluders, and such. We'll tell you what they are and what you need. This was a summary of Langstroth hive pieces. Our next lesson will be some guidance about purchasing other hive equipment. Kind of the insider's guide on how to go about it. Then we'll take you through the journey of other equipment that we just showed you. Whatever you need to fill out your kit so you could make all your purchases. Protective equipment comes after that. And then we start in on the directions for building your hive equipment that you have purchased, and we'll get you on your way. Thanks for watching. Hopefully we gave you the answers to the questions you might have had about this topic. If not, we'll see you soon at the online session. Or if it can't wait, you can shoot off an email to the email address listed or leave a comment down below. Take care, everybody, and we'll see you in the next lesson.